Good evening. For our final honors seminar project, we created a blog to discuss about how the housing development in Boston has affected certain neighborhoods. And we decided to visit neighborhoods including Roxbury, South End, and Mattapan to have a feel about how the local citizens and households were being affected with any related changes in their housing neighborhoods. So we decided to visit a couple of cafes as well as nonprofit services, including Rosie's Place in the South End. We looked at the South End branch, Villa Victoria, and in Mattapan as well. But each of us will be talking through one of our posts as well as other posts that we've written and how we reflected about it based on where we come from, how we felt when we saw these neighborhoods, and how what actions we believe could be taken after talking to certain of the people there, what we could do in order to mitigate the impact of gentrification there. So for me, I'll start off. Christian, I've written this post about Rosie's Place. And Rosie's Place, when we visited, we got a chance to talk with the volunteer manager there, Alyssa, who had been working there for about a year. And one of the recent changes that she's seen in Rosie's Place services was a greater demand in food. So the poor and homeless women who come every single day are needing more food every single time. And that is in a way related with the concept of housing crisis and gentrification a little bit, because they have a tighter budget in order to fulfill their household income's needs, and with higher rents, they are unable to be able to provide more for their family, so thus come to Rosie's Place in order to be taking every month 20 to 40 pounds of food for their families. So I learned a little bit about what the recent changes has been done at Rosie's, as well as what enforcements that may potentially be done. They discussed a lot about the $15 wage policy that needs to start getting implemented for these women to have a better sustainable life. But they haven't seen any recent changes in terms of new buildings coming up and taking over related with gentrification. But having a good idea of how this nonprofit has been affected a little bit over the housing crisis has given us a good overview about what to expect and maybe potentially in other neighborhoods. In addition, we also decided to visit the South End that Kurran will be talking about on his visit, as well as in his conversation with the South End librarian. So here's Kurran. They'll be talking to us a little bit about South End.
Yeah, so we had the opportunity to speak with the librarian Margaret at the South End branch of the Boston Public Library. She was a fixture of the community. She knew every person that came into the library, their parents, their family, where their family lived, how their family was doing. So she was really in touch with the community and the community's feelings. So she seemed like the perfect resource to go speak to about the problems of the quickly changing neighborhood. Her first comments were indictments of Northeastern's building policies. She says that the steel and glass monstrosities that they've been erecting on Tremont really take away from the old feel of the South End, and that really just adds to the changes that were already overcoming the South End, such as the loss of dollar stores and neighborhood boutiques to high-end restaurants and expensive clothing stores that no one without an incredibly high paycheck could ever afford to even go into. She went on to describe urban renewal, or as she said, urban removal, where the traditionally black neighborhoods were gutted to make room for highways and other city projects. And so then we asked her about what she thought of potential solutions to these issues. And she went on to explain that while there's no need to completely remove high-income residents, a more fair way to go about housing in the neighborhood would be to ensure that all new developments have splits of 1/3 affordable, 1/3 market rate, and 1/3 low-income rents in order to keep the neighborhoods equitable and as places that people of all economic means can live in. She also went on to talk about, as an example of what not to do, the ink block development in the South End, where with 541 new residences, only 51, or less than 10%, were marked for some sort of subsidized housing, as opposed to her suggestions of closer to 66, 67%. So that's really just an example of how the city has been developing the South End only for the rich. Just to briefly touch on some other places that I visited, I talked about Haley House in our class visit to the Haley House. I discussed quickly the story of the employee there who had left prison, was struggling to find work. He was doing his best. He was applying to jobs. He just really couldn't find anything despite his best efforts. And he ended up at Haley House, where he was lucky enough to get a job, join the program, and just hearing him talk was an inspiration as to how far someone can come when they're given the right resources and when they're not shut out by a community of wealthy people that don't care about the less well-off people who are also sharing the same space. And now Emma's going to talk about some of her posts.
Hi, so I am going to discuss this housing development project in the South End called Villa Victoria. So I became familiar with Villa Victoria last year through my honors mentor, Lauren Bard. She is the youth program director at IBA, which is the organization that owns the affordable housing units of Villa Victoria. And so while meeting her, she gave me a tour of the neighborhood and explained to me more of the history and then what's currently going on. And I thought that this was extremely interesting and that the history kind of also helps build our understanding of the housing, what's going on with housing and gentrification today. So in the early 20th century, the South End was abandoned by like the wealthier white people and became like a more affordable place for low-income immigrants to live, as well as people of color. And then in the 1950s, when, as Kurran mentioned, when urban renewal started to hit Boston, and we saw that the West End was destroyed, this was kind of a wake-up call to the people who lived in the Puerto Rican community who lived in the South End, that they needed to gather together to protect their community and the area that they loved. And so what they did is that they're able to come together, and they met in a church and they came together to create the Emergency Tenants Council, or the ETC, and they were able to petition the city of Boston for the rights to develop their neighborhood by themselves. And that's how Villa Victoria was created, was the development that the ETC created, which later became IBA. And so now and so I added some videos which explain this history in a little bit more detail, and there's a timeline as well as pictures of what the housing units look like. As Kurran mentioned, in the South End, the houses are not too tall, like very orderly, and these houses fit perfectly within like the sense of the community. Along with the sense of the community is the people who live here. It's like 60% Hispanic people live in Villa Victoria. Most of the units in Villa Victoria are low income. However, we see that there's many programs available to help the children in the neighborhood, such as the youth programs run by Lauren Bard, as well as programs to help like elderly people and many other different community organizations. And there's a great sense of community. But on the other hand, the community is also in jeopardy by the constant worry of not getting enough funding or outside grants to keep the projects going.
was perfect. So just to wrap up a little bit about what we've been discussing, our blog also includes an abouts page that is related with each of us, a biography of each of us, and as well as our intentions for this. So again, this post was created by Christian, Emma, and Kurran. And lastly, for one last thing,
We also each had several more posts that you can find by going to our blog. We each try to do at least 3, if not more, posts. So you can read more about what we've had to say about the topic at our blog.
Thank you.
thank you.